Obviously, we are here tonight to talk about a specific issue, which is international aid. And I think what more relevant issue in terms of its media presence, in terms of the challenges that face the poorest countries in the world, but also the relationship between countries in other parts of the world and the UK, which are so in the spotlight at the moment. And that's something that Mark's going to be talking obviously extensively about in his presentation, and there's very much an opportunity then for you as audience members to engage in the debate yourselves. So I'm delighted that Oxfam GB and Oxfam Cymru could support this event, and that Mark can be here with us tonight. And just before he starts, just to introduce him briefly, Mark Goldring has decades of experience in international development. He was Chief Executive of VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas, and he worked in the field for the UN Development Programme as well, and the UK's Department for International Development as Bangladesh Country Director of Oxfam in the 1990s. So he was Chief Executive of MENCAP for 5 years before joining Oxfam. He read law at Oxford and has a Master's in Social Planning from London School of Economics. So, because of all of this and his considerable services to tackling poverty and disadvantage, he was recognised in 2008 with the CBE. So we have a fantastic speaker here tonight, and I'd ask you to give a warm welcome to Mark Goldring.
In the last 20 years, the world has taken 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. That's an amazing achievement. 1 billion people, fewer, living in those terrible conditions that we see on our televisions and we all want to work to eradicate. 20 million of those people are in Ethiopia. It's still one of the poorest countries in the world. It's being hit by drought at the moment. But when I visited last week, I didn't only see drought. No one would associate that field of thriving crops with a drought which is actually worse than the drought that hit Ethiopia in 1985, that we remember so vividly from those terrible news broadcasts. That's a sign of progress, that development, that irrigation, that water, that logistics can make a significant difference. Let's not be mistaken, people are suffering in Ethiopia today, but there is not widespread malnutrition and death on anything like the scale that we have over the years associated with that terrible set of issues. Life is still tough. Life is so tough, and I take us back to our title, Should Charity Begin at Home? That when you see pictures like this, which is just ordinary daily life for people who are not hungry at the moment in Ethiopia, you get that sense of the importance of tackling the long-term issues which are keeping people poor. And that's something that Oxfam is committed to. It's something that countless other charities are committed to, and it's what aid is for. Aid can make a real difference in taking people out of poverty. In the short term, sometimes it's actually most important to keep people alive. And a lot of the work that charities are promoting is actually helping people in places like Ethiopia. That was photographed less than 1 week ago, and it's people congregating around an Oxfam installed tank in an area where there is nothing to eat or drink. That kind of humanitarian assistance is saving lives. And the challenge for us is to use aid to save lives from those who are suffering from emergencies and to promote better living, better standards, dignity, their rights for people who are living in chronic poverty. And I think aid at the moment is doing a really powerful and effective job of contributing to that. let's be really clear. Development is not first and foremost about aid. Aid is one contribution to development. And aid is not first and foremost about charities. Charities are one contribution to the sum total of aid. Britain is among the world's most generous donors of aid. It gives, in official aid, that's government, through our government, through our taxes, 0.7% of our gross national product every year. An amazing thing happened last year. That got legislated for. Future governments are bound to do that. It's deeply unpopular among some politicians, but it's an amazing achievement. Let's get it in proportion. That means that we spend on aid every year to try and assist approximately 1 billion poor people living across the world in extreme poverty, about the same as we spend on the NHS in Britain in 1 month. None of us are saying we should spend less on the NHS, but when people say that we're spending too much on aid for 1 billion people, let's remember what we're spending in a month on health for about 60 million people. Just keeping it in proportion is important. Britain is not typical. America gives less than 2% of its GNP as aid every year. The global average is about 0.35. I think probably now nobody is giving more than 1%. And what we're actually seeing is existing spending coming down across the world. Conservative governments with a small c across the world reducing their spend, at the same time as a Conservative government with a capital C in Britain has continued to increase it. But also more and more money being spent in Europe on what we're calling aid, but which is actually about security, counter-terrorism, defence, migration-related issues. That's very delicate, and we're seeing in many of the world's most generous donors more of their money being spent at home than now they were spending before, and less being spent in the developing world. But Britain has achieved a lot and is contributing to a lot. This is just a few quick figures on what Britain's official aid programme has contributed to. Children under 5 and pregnant women being helped with nutrition. 11 million more children going to school. Children being born safely, and part of an amazing and undertold global success story on malaria. The number of people suffering malaria and dying from it has more than halved in the last decade. Anybody who's worked in Africa and Asia knows the impact of malaria on people's life, their well-being, their ability to work, and how that destroys assets when you're repeatedly sick. You have to sell off all you've got for healthcare. You can't work. This is an amazing achievement. More and more people getting fresh water and sanitation. And humanitarian assistance responding to more and more people. Now, as poverty has got less extreme, or rather fewer people living in extreme poverty, what we've actually seen is more people suffering from humanitarian disasters. In 2002, that's just, 15 years ago, the world spent £2 billion a year on responding to humanitarian disasters. Last year, the world spent 25 billion, and more people went unserved. What that's showing is the combination of conflict, Syria is a perfect example. Destroying progress and climate change undermining it together are leading to more people being displaced and in need of assistance. And let's be clear, that's not helping development, that's helping people to live while we try and rebuild the conditions for development. So we're seeing some positives and we're seeing some massive challenges. Climate change is among the greatest of those challenges, and we can't address it by lots of little projects. We've actually got to address it by the way we produce energy, how much coal we use, how the developed world pollutes and undermines the chances of development in the poorer world. Those are issues of policy, and at the same time we've got to help people adapt their lives. I went not long ago to Zambia, and I talked to a group of villagers who we had helped run a pilot program to test improved crops. Those crops were giving them a far better yield, and they were reluctant to take them up more widely. And I couldn't understand why. And eventually one of the young people in the community said, the trouble is we don't know when the rains are going to come next year. If these crops are not safe for us to use with or without the rains that we traditionally get, we're going to waste all of our money. How can we invest? So not only is it destroying progress, it's destroying people's confidence in building for the future. Now, I'm not asking anyone to read the details of that graph, but I just want to use it to bring out one or two things. When I said that development, that's improving the quality of people's lives, is not primarily about aid, I want to point out these are financial flows into the developing world. This is a 25-year period along the bottom. What you can see is how much more money is flowing into the developing world than was doing 25 years ago. But only the bottom red line is official aid. The big change is FDI, foreign direct investment. So this depends on creating the conditions of stability. That means companies will invest money, which is what's going to create jobs. And they might be international companies, they might be local companies. If you're a rich person in Zimbabwe, you will not invest your money in a company in Zimbabwe because you've got no idea what's going to happen politically next, unless you're one of a very small number of friends of the president. You'll invest it outside Africa. So this is about local investment and international investment. The next really big one that I want to highlight is the blue one. This is money coming from the diaspora. It's an amazingly powerful force to help people for humanitarian reasons and for development reasons. And then the next big one is loans. But no one's going to lend money to a basket case. So one of the jobs of aid is actually to help make the conditions where this investment is going to happen. And another one is actually to try and make sure that poor people really benefit from all of this investment, and it doesn't only go to the richest communities. The next graph, and this is the only graph, I promise you. Oh, there's one more. Don't worry about the letters, but I just want to highlight one important set of issues. These are the world's poorest countries, and these are the world's middle-income countries. In the poorest countries, aid is of massive importance. That's the green bar. In the middle-income countries, the Indias and Chinas of this world, the South Africas, the emerging markets, the Brazils, aid is of tiny importance, and this is all about investment and trade. So what you can see is that aid is massively significant to those countries that can't promote enterprise, can't raise taxes, for public expenditure. It's much less important in the world's middle-income countries. And so any reduction in aid hits the poorest in the world far more than it hits the middle-income countries. I want to talk a little bit, though, about policy, because policies make a huge difference to whether aid is effective. And on this graph, you've got 3 countries: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. India is roughly twice as rich as Bangladesh in terms of income. But Bangladesh has got greater life expectancy, fewer people dying in childbirth, more children being immunised, and more women being literate. It's done that because of social policy. It's done that because it's focused its investment and its charitable funding and its aid funding on the things that make the biggest difference to poor people. India's created a much better climate for investment, but actually spending money on basic things like immunisation, on women's education, make a much bigger difference in the short run to poor people. Now, it's not that we need one or we need the other, we need both. But if we don't actually create the environment that allow poor people to benefit, aid will be of no use at all, except in keeping people alive. Now, I was giving a talk on India and Bangladesh in a different forum last year, and one person in the audience just stood up and said, "Toilets." What he was saying was investments in things like sanitation really help poor people. Bangladesh has had invested in low-cost sanitation. India had not until the last year. What that meant was all of those water-borne diseases and fecally-borne diseases were massively hitting poor people. So aid can be used to support good policy. It can't replace good policy, except in bringing immediate relief to poor people. The other dimension that comes out from this is focusing on women. One of the things that aid does well is really help say, what do we have to do for women to benefit from this? And if you look at an example like Bangladesh, it hasn't got particularly good governance, it hasn't got high levels of income, but it's invested in family planning to give women choice on the size of their family. And at the other end, it's also attracted jobs in the garments industry to Bangladesh. They're not perfect jobs by any means, but they mean that women choose to stay in school because they've got a chance of a job at the end of it. And what did they have to do to keep girls in school? Most important thing was actually to build separate and properly hygienic latrines in the school compounds for girls. So that balance of social policies can make a vast difference. This graph shows the fall in global poverty over the last 25 years. About 45% of the world's population living in extreme poverty 25 years ago, down to under 20% in 2010, 2012. That is 1 billion people less. The graph then begins to split, and it can come up here with minor reductions, or it can virtually eradicate poverty in 2030, which is what the Sustainable Development Goals say is possible and we're all aiming to do. The light blue shading on the graph is the question of what will happen. And actually, much of what happens is in the world's hands. And by the world, I mean the combination of global policies promoted by international organizations, aid programs promoted by donors, domestic programs promoted by governments, and the kind of work that we're all involved in terms of charities, civic linking, support to most marginalised communities. So what does these set of options, which is basically 500 million people, more or less, depending on the choices we make, what does that involve? Climate change is one, conflict is one. Where you have wars, you don't have progress. You have people living in terrible misery. The Syrian crisis now is creating a new class of poor people who did not exist 5 years ago. That's 10 million more people living in poverty now than were 5 years ago. So conflict and political solutions to conflict, desperately important in this. Corruption and the quality of governance will make a vast difference. Earlier in the seminar, Martha and I were talking about Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe reaching progress, losing it through bad governance. South Sudan probably never had the good governance, just showed some steps in that direction, and everything being destroyed now. But there are also things that we can control more readily. One of the most fundamental issues in terms of do we end up with 600 million people or 100 million people living in extreme poverty in 15 years' time is how we deal with the fruits of growth. Rising inequality is undermining our efforts to eradicate poverty. If you have the 62 richest people in the world owning the same amount of wealth as half the world's population, 3.5 billion, it's quite hard to make that money go round. And our choice of policies is something that we can influence as citizens of the world. Taxation is a very obvious one. So as Oxfam and working with like-minded organisations, we're putting just as much effort into try and encourage governments of the rich countries to stop people moving their assets around the world and taxing them in the Bahamas. I never knew that they mined copper in the Cayman Islands until I went to Zambia. And they told me that much of their copper receipts seem to be being declared in the Cayman Islands where there is no corporate tax. But also tax within countries. In South Africa, which is one of the best run tax services in Africa, the tax authorities believe that of the 10,000 richest multimillionaires in the country, less than 1,000 are registered for income tax, and only 200 are fully paid up. One of the richest men in the world said, "Why is it that I seem to pay tax at a lower rate than my secretary?" Well, with money goes power, and with power goes more money. So tackling that issue of tax avoidance, corporate levels and individual levels, is the kind of thing that can reduce inequality. Alongside fair wages, there are too many people in the world working for wages that simply do not allow them to stay alive. So those issues of a living wage, social investment of the sort I was describing in Bangladesh, schools, health services make a vast difference, and the extent to which gender politics play out in terms of policy and we give women a fair chance are all part of that. Now, we've got to tackle this in practical ways. We can't just pontificate about it. Well, I can, but it doesn't make a lot of difference. So we've got to find ways of really tackling this. A couple of years ago, Oxfam launched a program, and we identified the 10 biggest food companies in the world, food and beverage companies, that have massive international influence. You cannot be a food and beverage company without sourcing things like sugar from Africa, without sourcing palm oil or other forms of soya or other forms of oil from Africa and Asia. So you're creating huge numbers of jobs in many developing countries. You're also paying taxes, you're involving women, you're accessing land. You have a supply chain which goes miles and miles and miles down and has tentacles right across the country. And we identified 7 issues: land, women, farmers, workers, transparency, water, and something that's very important that I can't read. 7 different headings, and we used a really geekish approach to identify 240 different indicators of the way those companies behaved. We created a chart on them, and we then started scoring the companies and dialoguing with the companies. We tried to create a race to the top, and we've updated this every 6 months over the last 3 years. Just to give you an example, Coca-Cola, which is actually the biggest food and beverage company in the world by turnover, signed up as a result of this campaign to a convention on land rights. It also required its whole supply chain, which is all the producers of sugar and everything else, to sign up to it, which is making a huge difference to the way land is being bought with or without communities' consent. What happens to displaced people in many, many African countries? Because they required all their suppliers to sign up to it, this had a multiplier effect that was absolutely vast. So this kind of policy engagement can try and ensure that poor people benefit from rather than are harmed by the fruits of development and investment. So we need to do practical things. In Ethiopia, people who are suffering from the drought can't wait for us to get the policies right next year or the year after. We have to do practical things, and we have to challenge the policy. I was acutely aware of this. This is a photo from Zambia, where I visited a community school. Now, generally, Oxfam does not build schools. Many worthwhile organisations do. But there is a group of people in Zambia, in areas which are very rural, where the government schools network is just not delivering. And our staff on the ground felt that the advocacy work to change the government's policies, which is so fundamental to who Oxfam are, was not acceptable. You can't say to people, I know there are no schools for your children now, but don't worry, we're lobbying the government, and in a few years it might be different. You've actually got to do something now, and you've got to try and influence the policies for the future. And I think that is the fundamental story of why charitable giving is important and how aid can work most effectively. We've got to do the practical things today, but we've got to try and influence the policies that keep people poor. So what Oxfam did in Zambia was support a network of parents' organisations who were setting up their own school, and then we funded a small Zambian NGO in the capital to be researching who's not going to school and why, and presenting those findings to the government of Zambia and to the international donors. So that practical work and that influencing policy at its best is where I think charities can contribute. Everyone will have their own niche. Everyone will find their own place within it. But it helps force the big money, which is the government money, and the private investment money to be used in a way that benefits the poorest.